Welcome the anointed ones. Some people weren't sent to love you. They were sent to study your breaking point, but walked away broken instead. Let that sink in, because what I'm about to reveal will make the hairs on your neck stand up. See, there are people, yes, real people, who walk among us every day with no conscience, no empathy, no remorse. And no, this isn't some Netflix docu-series. It's spiritual warfare in real time. They're what psychologists call high-functioning psychopaths. But what the chosen ones know them as is spiritually bankrupt predators. And guess what? Someone out there got bold enough to assign one of these emotionally hollow agents to you. They gave this person one job: invade your mind, terrorize your soul, and reduce your divine energy to rubble. They thought you'd crumble like all the others. But they didn't account for one thing. You weren't their victim, you were their reckoning. And the craziest part, they came to play the villain, but ended up needing therapy. Oh, the irony. Because instead of watching you fall apart, they watched themselves unravel, haunted by your calm, confused by your silence, and spiritually scorched by your light. So buckle up, because by the end of this video, you're going to realize that you didn't just survive a psycho, you psychologically dismantled one. And you didn't do it with revenge or rage. You did it by being exactly what they feared the most, unshakably whole. Let's get into it. Number 1. They didn't expect the monster to recognize a mirror. They didn't send that psychopath to hurt you randomly. They sent them thinking you'd fold. They believed this person would infiltrate your life, tear through your boundaries, confuse you, drain you, and leave you questioning your own sanity. What they didn't expect was that the moment this person got close to you, they'd get scared. Not because you raised your voice, not because you fought back violently, but because the very thing that makes you the chosen one, your soul's depth, started showing them something they never expected, themselves. You weren't reacting the way they were used to. You didn't cling to their love bombing. You didn't get desperate when they ghosted you. You didn't melt under their manipulation. Instead, you remained calm, unbothered, self-contained. And the longer they stayed around you, the more uncomfortable they became. Why? Because you were the mirror they spent their whole life avoiding. They were sent to expose you, but all you did was reflect every crack in their fake persona. You forced them to feel the emptiness inside themselves. A psychopath lives off control. They feed off drama and chaos because it gives them a false sense of power. But when they couldn't provoke you, they started unraveling. You weren't giving them fear. You weren't giving them obsession. You weren't giving them pain they could feed on. Instead, you were giving them silence with eyes that saw straight through the mask. That silence, that presence, that scared the hell out of them. They weren't prepared to meet someone who wasn't afraid of them. They weren't prepared to be looked at without being fooled. And the more they realized you weren't reacting like their past victims, the more they realized they were out of their depth. So they ran. Not because you were weak, but because you were too strong for them to manipulate, too pure for them to infect, and too spiritually evolved for their darkness to latch onto. You didn't just scare them off. You exposed them to themselves, and that's the one thing a psychopath cannot survive. Number 2. Psychopaths thrive on predictability, but you were an algorithm they couldn't crack. Psychopaths are obsessed with patterns. Control isn't just their habit, it's their entire system. They study people like puzzles. They learn how to press your buttons, how to copy your emotions, how to predict your reactions. It's all strategy to them. They come in knowing exactly which mask to wear, what fake wounds to show, what lies to drip feed you. And for most people, it works. Most people get caught in their web because they fall into the trap of being emotionally predictable. But not you. You completely threw them off. They couldn't figure you out. One moment you were kind, the next moment you were distant. One day you were calm and observant. The next you were brutally honest and spiritually impenetrable. You didn't react to their games the way others did. You didn't panic. You didn't chase. You didn't break down and beg. You just kept responding from a place they had no access to, your divine core. You weren't operating from ego or fear or attachment. You were moving with spiritual clarity. And to someone who thrives off predictable emotional chaos, that's terrifying. You didn't follow the rules of their manipulation. You weren't afraid to walk away. You didn't need them to validate you. You didn't get confused when they tried to gaslight you. Your energy kept saying, "I see you," and they didn't know what to do with that. You were the first person they couldn't study. You weren't a puzzle to be solved. You were a code they couldn't crack. And what happens when a psychopath can't predict someone? They panic. They lose their power. They start making mistakes. They spiral, because their whole game is built on knowing your next move before you make it. But your connection to God, your intuition, your emotional discipline, it short-circuited their entire plan. You weren't just unpredictable, you were untouchable. And the more they tried to figure you out, the more they felt themselves slipping. You didn't just escape their control, you ruined the control panel altogether. Number 3, you intimidated them with what you didn't need. Psychopaths come in confident. They come believing they hold the upper hand because they've learned how to manipulate people through their needs. They know how to offer fake love to the lonely, fake security to the insecure, fake attention to the unseen. They feed on your hunger, and that's how they trap you. But when they met you, something went terribly wrong in their plan. You didn't need what they were selling. You weren't desperate for validation. You weren't craving affection. You weren't trying to be chosen. And that alone stripped their power before they could even use it. You see, psychopaths aren't strong. They're opportunists. They find the cracks in people's identity and slip in. But with you, there was no emotional debt to collect. You had already healed things in silence. You already knew how to be alone. You already knew how to self-validate. You weren't walking around with open wounds waiting to be bandaged. So everything they offered, you saw as unnecessary. You weren't impressed. You weren't moved. You weren't flattered. And that confused them. It enraged them. Because suddenly, they were in a situation they hadn't trained for. A person they couldn't bait. They couldn't use sex to lure you in. They couldn't use attention to hook you. They couldn't use guilt because you didn't carry shame. And the most terrifying part? You weren't even trying to resist them. You just genuinely didn't need them. That shook them more than anger or confrontation ever could. That's why they left. That's why they spiraled. Not because you attacked them, but because you couldn't be owned. They came expecting to feed off your emotional hunger, but all they found was a soul that had already eaten. You were full of clarity, full of peace, full of spiritual independence. And when a manipulator realizes there's nothing in you they can exploit, they don't just lose interest, they lose control. That's when the game ends. Because the moment they understand you can't be seduced, controlled, or emotionally starved, you stop being a target, you start being a threat. Number 4, your aura exposed their lack of substance. Psychopaths survive by pretending to be powerful. They wear confidence like a costume. They copy emotions, study behavior, and perform charm. It's all theater, a convincing act built to manipulate the weak and impress the unaware. But when they got close to you, that act started falling apart. Not because you said anything, not because you fought them, but because your aura did what words never could. It exposed the emptiness underneath their performance. Your presence was different. You didn't try to dominate, but you had real power. The kind of power that doesn't shout, doesn't show off, and doesn't need an audience. Your energy was still but heavy, calm but commanding. That's what made them uncomfortable. They were used to impressing people with their fake strength, but next to you, their energy felt small, cheap, even silly. You didn't flinch when they tried to intimidate you. You didn't melt when they turned on the charm. You didn't play along with the roles they tried to assign you. And that's when the mask started slipping. The truth is, your authenticity made them feel like a fraud. You were grounded, rooted, clear. There was no confusion in your spirit, no chaos in your energy. And that kind of clarity is dangerous to a psychopath because it brings out what they've spent their whole life hiding, their lack of real substance. They have no real center, no spiritual depth. Everything about them is curated. But you were real. You weren't performing strength. You were strength. And they felt it the second they got too close. That's why they pulled away. That's why they started unraveling. Because next to your purity, their power looked like a cheap magic trick. Your light didn't just expose them, it embarrassed them. And when someone's entire identity is built on illusion, being seen for what they really are isn't just uncomfortable, it's unbearable. Number 5. They weren't sent to break you. They were sent to measure you. They thought they were the predator, sent to shatter you from the inside out. But the truth is, they were the instrument, not the threat. Heaven allowed them near you for one reason: to reveal exactly how much of yourself you've mastered. Not how loud you could roar, but how calm you could stay. Not how hard you could fight, but how deeply you could trust your inner knowing. That psychopath wasn't a punishment. They were a measuring tool. And the moment they stepped into your world, your real strength stepped forward, without force, without drama, without needing to prove anything. They tried every tactic they had: emotional confusion, manipulation, mind games, passive aggression, love bombing, withdrawal. But instead of reacting, you observed. Instead of falling into their web, you let them tangle themselves in it. You didn't scream or chase or beg. You didn't explain your worth. You didn't even bother trying to be understood. And that's when the test turned into a revelation. Not about them, but about you. Because anyone can act wise in peaceful conditions, but true self-mastery shows up when you're placed in the presence of someone completely chaotic, and you remain centered. You didn't get caught up in their illusions. You stayed grounded in who you are. And in doing that, you flipped the script. You weren't being measured for weakness. They were being measured against your strength, and they failed, miserably. Not because they weren't skilled manipulators, but because you've outgrown the traps that used to work on the old version of you. You've done the shadow work. You've confronted your own wounds. You've built internal clarity. And now, not even a demon in disguise can shake your foundation. They walked in thinking they'd drive you to the edge. Instead, they lost their own sense of direction. Because when someone's entire game is built on shaking others, and you don't move, it's their world that falls apart. You weren't just tested, you became the test. And they failed it, spectacularly. Number 6, you starved their demon. Psychopaths don't just want control, they need your pain to breathe. It's their fuel. Your confusion gives them clarity, your breakdown gives them pleasure. Your emotional chaos becomes their sense of power. They aren't just messing with you for fun, they are feeding off of you. Every tear, every doubt, every moment you second-guess yourself, that's a meal for the demon riding their back. But when they met you, something unexpected happened. You didn't feed them. You didn't give them the drama they were starving for. You left their demon at the dinner table with nothing but silence and stillness. They poked at your wounds, and you didn't bleed. They tried to trigger you, and you didn't explode. They tried to confuse you, and you stayed rooted. That wasn't just self-control, that was spiritual warfare. Because what most people don't understand is this: psychopaths aren't just manipulative people. They're often vessels for something darker, and that something needs your emotional breakdown to live. But you cut off its supply. You didn't collapse, you didn't react, you didn't fall apart. You fasted emotionally, spiritually, and energetically, and their demon couldn't handle the starvation. They started getting irritated for no reason, agitated by your peace, uncomfortable in your presence. Because you weren't a victim, you were a dry well. And demons don't thrive in droughts, they wither. That's what was happening. The spiritual parasite using them was expecting a feast, but instead it walked into a famine. And when you starve a dark spirit of the energy it feeds on, it doesn't just get weak, it runs. That's why they ghosted you, blocked you, or lashed out one final time and vanished. It wasn't random, it was a retreat. You weren't just difficult, you were spiritually unpalatable. You had no guilt to exploit, no insecurity to hook into, no chaos to amplify, just boundaries, discernment, and a soul too clean for their poison. That's what scared them. That's what sent them running. You didn't just survive the psychopath, you starved their demon straight into exile. Number 7, you saw the script before they played it. They thought they were running the game, but you had already read the entire script before the opening scene even played out. That's the thing about chosen ones. You don't just sense energy, you recognize spiritual blueprints. Patterns don't lie, people do. And when they showed up with their charm, fake empathy, and carefully timed vulnerability, it didn't feel new to you. It felt familiar. You'd seen it before, in different faces, with different voices, but always the same tired formula. And instead of getting caught in their performance, you studied it like a rerun you already knew the ending to. Most people get swept up in the act. They want to believe in love, in connection, in the best version of someone. But you don't deal in fantasy, you deal in truth. And the moment they made their first move, you clocked the entire framework. The fake bonding, the baiting, the calculated affection, the slow erosion of your confidence. You weren't confused. You were calculating. You saw their angle before they leaned into it. And what really threw them off was that you didn't react. You just watched. You let them believe they were pulling the strings while you were taking mental notes. You weren't playing defense. You were setting a trap. Not out of pettiness, but because you were done letting snakes think they were smarter than you. You weren't being passive. You were being surgical. Every time you overlooked a red flag, you were collecting proof. Every time you fell for one of their lies, you were silently flipping through their entire playbook. And when the moment came, when you had seen enough, when the act had become too sloppy to maintain, you didn't scream. You didn't beg. You vanished with precision. No warning, no closure, no scene, just gone. And they were left stunned because they thought they had you wrapped. What they didn't know was that you were 10 moves ahead the whole time, reading their tactics like an old script with weak characters and a predictable plot. You didn't just survive their game, you outrode it. Number 8, they planned for a fight, but got a funeral. They came in looking for a reaction. Yelling, crying, confusion, anything to shake your spirit and feed their illusion of power. That's the plan. Provoke you, then point at your reaction and say, "See? You're the problem." They were fully prepared for that script. They had rehearsed it. Manipulators like them build their identity around conflict, because as long as you're reacting, they get to feel in control. But this time, the energy didn't go their way. You didn't fight. You didn't break. You didn't give them the chaos they wanted. And instead of lighting a fire, they walked straight into their own reckoning. You didn't play the victim. You became the mirror. And when someone who thrives on illusion comes face to face with someone who only deals in truth, things start to fall apart. Fast. They weren't expecting their own darkness to rise up in front of them. But your silence had weight. Your calm had heat. Your refusal to participate in their games acted like a spiritual summons. The mask started slipping. Their lies started crumbling. The image they spent years crafting couldn't survive in the atmosphere of your clarity. What was supposed to be a setup turned into exposure. Without raising your voice, you raised their buried demons. Without swinging, you triggered their collapse. Because when you stop feeding a persona, it begins to rot. That's what happened. They weren't destroyed by you. They were destroyed by their own reflection in your presence. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need to prove anything. All you had to do was be exactly who you are, and the light you carry did the work for you. They came thinking it would be another round of control, but instead, they had to watch their false self die in real time. It wasn't a battle, it was a burial, and the only thing that got buried that day was the mask they could never wear again. Number 9. You weren't scared because you've met worse in your own bloodline. The reason you didn't flinch, didn't lose your ground, didn't break down when that psychopath tried to terrorize you is because chaos wasn't new to you. It was old news. You weren't scared because your spirit was already battle-tested in the hardest arenas, your own family. You've seen the wolves disguised as protectors, the silent coldness behind forced smiles, the subtle poison in words meant to sting. You've faced manipulation, betrayal, and cruelty from those who were supposed to nurture and shield you. So when the psychopath stepped in, they weren't bringing a fresh storm. They were just a rerun of the old trauma you learned to survive. They thought they were scary. But you? You were a veteran of wars no one talks about. You carried the memories of being emotionally cornered by people who should have loved you unconditionally but didn't know how. The gaslighting, the mind games, the unpredictable outbursts, those were your first teachers. The dysfunction that should have broken you instead built a fortress around your soul. You weren't just surviving, you were outliving those ghosts that tried to cage your spirit. So the psychopath, no matter how loud or vicious, didn't introduce anything new. They only triggered a familiarity deep inside, reminding you of wounds you already healed or learned to live above. That's why you weren't scared. That's why you didn't fall into their trap, because you've met worse. You've walked through darker nights with people whose names are tied to your bloodline, and every time you survived, you gained a little more armor. You didn't just grow stronger, you grew wiser. You didn't just learn how to protect yourself, you learned how to recognize the patterns before the damage could begin. When the psychopath showed up, you didn't see a new enemy. You saw an old story trying to repeat itself, and you shut that chapter down without hesitation, because your history wasn't just pain, it was your training ground. Number 10. You were the first target who didn't need saving. Psychopaths thrive on control, and one of their favorite tricks is the rescue game. They come in acting like your savior, the one who understands your pain better than anyone else, the hero who'll pull you out of the dark. But it's all a setup. That rescue is just a trap. They lift you up only to break you down again, over and over, feeding off the chaos they create. It's a cycle that leaves most people drained, confused, and desperate for their approval. But you weren't a wounded soul waiting for a savior. You were already whole before they even showed up. That's what scared them most. When they tried to swoop in, flash that false compassion, and hook you into their game, it didn't stick. You didn't crave their help because you didn't need it. You didn't depend on their approval because your foundation was solid. There was no brokenness to exploit, no vulnerability to latch onto. You weren't a damsel in distress. You were a fortress. That meant their usual tactics were useless. Without dependency, there's no control. Without control, their power evaporates. They found themselves trying harder, pushing boundaries, getting desperate. But nothing worked. You didn't fall for the rescue narrative. You didn't buy their false promises. You saw through the act because you were already your own hero. That's why they hated you. Not because you fought back, but because you didn't need to fight at all. They couldn't break you down, and that left them powerless and exposed. In a world where many are struggling to find their strength, you were the first target who didn't need saving. You showed up, whole, unshaken, and unbreakable. And that truth? It's the ultimate kryptonite for a psychopath. Number 11. Your spiritual immunity made their games obsolete. When someone is demonically driven, their survival depends on attaching to your wounds, feeding off the trauma you carry like a parasite. They expect to find cracks, open doors, anything vulnerable to exploit. But your healing wasn't just surface level. It ran deep, like armor forged in fire and time. There was no entry point for their poison because you had already cleansed the terrain they try to infect. You weren't just calm or unbothered. You were immune. This immunity isn't about being numb or indifferent. It's about a profound restoration of your spirit that rewrites how energy moves through you. Your soul no longer reacts to old triggers because those triggers have been understood, faced, and released. Your nervous system isn't a playground for manipulation anymore. Their lies, their emotional warfare, their threats, all bounce off a barrier they can't see or touch. When they came to disrupt your peace, they hit a dead end. They weren't just met with silence. They were met with a spiritual firewall that short-circuited their schemes. Their usual tricks, gaslighting, guilt-tripping, chaos, were obsolete because they were trying to weaponize trauma you no longer carried. Your healing wasn't fragile or temporary. It was a fortress. It had no cracks, no weak links, no spaces for their darkness to creep in. What most don't realize is that true spiritual immunity isn't passive. It's active. It's a daily choice to refuse their entry, to refuse to be baited, to refuse to participate in the drama. And because of that choice, their games don't work anymore. You've evolved beyond their reach. You aren't just surviving their presence, you are dismantling their power with every breath you take. In the face of someone driven by darkness, your healed soul doesn't just resist, it renders their attacks meaningless. Their poison has nowhere to land because your bloodstream doesn't carry what they need to thrive. Number 12. They couldn't possess what they couldn't define. Psychopaths depend on clear definitions. They need to box people into neat categories: friend, lover, ally, enemy, because it gives them control and predictability. When they know where you stand, they know how to manipulate you. Labels become weapons, and once you're labeled, you're vulnerable. But you didn't fit their mold. You were shapeless, fluid, constantly evolving in ways they couldn't pin down. That made you dangerous to them. Your multidimensional nature wasn't just about being complex. It was about being unknowable. You defied their expectations because you refused to be trapped in a single identity or role. One moment you might show kindness. The next, fierce boundary setting. You carried contradictions, layers, and mysteries that kept them off balance. They couldn't predict your reactions because you didn't follow their script. This undefinable presence destabilized them far more than any direct confrontation ever could. Psychopaths thrive on certainty, on patterns they can exploit. But you were a walking paradox. Without labels, you were like water slipping through their fingers, impossible to capture or control. The more they tried to name you, the more you shifted, leaving them grasping at air. Because they couldn't define you, they couldn't possess you. Possession isn't just physical. It's psychological, energetic. And without a clear target or a fixed identity to invade, their attempts to dominate you fell flat. They were trying to control a ghost, a force that refused to be tamed. In their eyes, that was terrifying. Not because you were loud or aggressive, but because you were unpredictable and uncontainable. You didn't just resist them, you existed beyond their framework entirely. And in that existence, you were free. That freedom made their control obsolete and their power crumble. Number 13. You forced them to face something worse than rejection: insignificance. You didn't waste your energy trying to prove yourself to them, or get caught up in their desperate attempts for attention or control. You didn't fight. You didn't chase. You didn't even engage. You simply saw them for what they were: broken, desperate, starved for validation, and then turned away. That kind of indifference is a weapon far sharper than any argument or confrontation. For psychopaths and narcissists, rejection stings, but insignificance kills. Their whole existence depends on being noticed, on being feared, on being the center of attention. When you refuse to give them that spotlight, when you treat them like background noise, a flicker they don't even bother acknowledging, it shatters their carefully constructed world. Their grand illusions of power and control come crashing down because suddenly they aren't relevant. They become invisible, powerless, empty. Your silence wasn't weakness or submission. It was surgical, precise, and intentional. It hit where it hurt most, their ego's desperate need to matter. You forced them to face the void inside themselves, a void so deep that no amount of manipulation or cruelty could fill it. They tried to haunt you, to unsettle you, but you weren't listening. You weren't reacting. You weren't playing their game. In that moment, you became their reckoning, not by shouting or fighting, but by simply existing without them being able to touch you. The silence you offered was not surrender. It was a verdict. You buried their delusions beneath an unshakable calm that spoke louder than any battle cry ever could. And in that silence, they found their worst enemy, their own insignificance. Number 14. God let them enter, but you were the trap. When God allows something dark to enter your life, it's never random, especially not for the chosen ones. Psychopaths show up thinking they're the hunters, the predators ready to tear you apart. But what they don't realize is that they're actually walking straight into a trap set by a higher power. You weren't just a target, you were the trap itself. This isn't about luck or chance. The universe doesn't waste energy sending threats to destroy you. It sends them so you can reveal your true power. The psychopath came with intentions to break you. But what they found was something far more dangerous to them: divine judgment in human form. Your presence wasn't just a barrier. It was an executioner of their falsehoods, lies, and evil designs. They believed they could play their games and walk away unscathed. But every move they made only tightened the noose they didn't see. You became the living consequence of their actions, a walking reckoning they couldn't avoid. It's like they entered a battlefield they didn't understand, and you were both the terrain and the storm. This divine intervention means their presence wasn't a mistake or a test for you. It was their moment of undoing. You weren't just surviving their chaos, you were dismantling it from the inside out. They didn't just meet you. They met a force far greater than themselves, a cosmic justice embodied in your strength, resilience, and unshakable spirit. In allowing them to enter, God wasn't exposing your weakness. He was setting the stage for their downfall. You were never the prey. You were the trap laid by destiny itself, and the moment they stepped in, their destruction was already written. In the end, what they thought would be their victory became their unraveling. The psychopath was sent not to break you, but to reveal the unbreakable within you. You stood, not as prey, but as the unshakable fortress, silent yet fierce, untouchable yet profoundly present. Every attempt to intimidate, control, or diminish you was met with a force they couldn't comprehend or conquer. Your authentic power, forged through trials they could never endure. This wasn't just survival, it was transcendence. You didn't just scare away the storm, you became the calm that dissolves it. Remember, the greatest strength isn't loud or aggressive. It's the steady flame inside that no darkness can snuff out. And that flame? It's yours, fiercely alive, forever untouchable, and eternally victorious. If this message spoke to you, and you're ready to stand stronger in your truth, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join this powerful community. Like the video if it moved you. Drop a comment to share your story or thoughts. I want to hear from you. And don't keep this energy to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Together we rise, unshaken and unstoppable.